To the arrogant man at the head of the table, he was just an old man, a relic from a forgotten time, wearing a frayed and worthless piece of cloth around his neck. To the ambitious son sitting beside him, he was a source of quiet embarrassment, a loving but inconvenient reminder of a simpler, less polished world. The tie, a birthday gift given without thought, was a symbol of that embarrassment. It was thin, its pattern faded, its fabric a cheap, unassuming wool that had no place in the opulent, wood-paneled dining room of a restaurant where a single bottle of wine cost more than the old man's entire monthly pension. The air was thick with the scent of money, of seared steak and old leather, and in that atmosphere, the tie was an insult. A joke. The boss, a man named Sterling whose suit was as sharp as his condescending smile, gestured toward it with a silver fork, the tines catching the dim, expensive light. An interesting choice, David, he'd said, his voice a low, theatrical purr that carried across the pristine white tablecloth. He wasn't speaking to the old man, of course. He was speaking to the son, the junior executive who sat stiffly in his chair, his own silk tie a perfect, shimmering knot of anxiety. It tells a story. A very, humble story. The old man, Arthur, didn't flinch. His hands, gnarled and weathered like the roots of an ancient oak, rested on his lap. He had said nothing for the past 10 minutes, a silent island in a sea of corporate chatter. His gaze was distant, fixed on something beyond the polished walls, beyond the clinking glasses and forced laughter. To them, he was just another old man, a charity case brought to a dinner he could never afford. To them, the tie was a mark of his station, a badge of his insignificance. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly comprehend, was that the tie was indeed a badge. It was a uniform. And the story it told wasn't one of humility, but of a silence so profound, so heavy with sacrifice, that it could deafen the world. They saw a cheap tie, but they were blind to the threads it was woven from. They didn't see the dust of forgotten battlefields, the sweat of impossible missions, the blood of brothers long since gone. They didn't see the knot, tied with a precision that had nothing to do with fashion and everything to do with a code of honor they would never understand. In their world of fleeting value and loud pronouncements, they had forgotten how to recognize true worth. They had forgotten that the most dangerous men, the most important men, are often the quietest ones. And as the disrespect mounted, as the air grew colder with unspoken judgments, a reckoning was silently approaching, a truth waiting to be unveiled that would shatter their fragile reality. The cheap tie was not the punchline. It was the fuse. And it had just been lit. Welcome to our channel. We believe that true stories of honor and courage are all around us, hidden in plain sight. If you've ever felt overlooked, or know someone whose quiet dignity deserves a voice, then you've come to the right place. Join our community of storytellers by subscribing and ringing the bell, because you won't want to miss the incredible conclusion to this story. What do you think is the true measure of a person's worth? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and let's explore this journey together. The silence was Arthur's shield, and his home was his fortress. It was a small, unassuming house on a street lined with identical houses, each with a neatly trimmed lawn and a quiet history. Inside, however, Arthur's world was anything but identical. It was a testament to a life lived with purpose, a life of meticulous order and quiet reverence for the past. His workshop in the basement was not the cluttered den of a hobbyist, it was a sanctuary. Every tool hung in its designated place, cleaned and oiled, not as an instrument, but as a trusted companion. He worked with wood, carving intricate figures of soldiers and animals, each piece a silent story. He never sold them. They were for him, for the memories they held. He lived a life of routine. Up at dawn. A simple breakfast. Hours in the workshop, the only sound the soft scrape of a chisel against wood. A walk in the afternoon, his pace steady despite a faint, almost imperceptible limp he never acknowledged. He spoke little, asked for nothing, and expected the same in return. His son, David, was the opposite. David was a man of the new world, a world of noise, of ambition, of relentless forward motion. He loved his father, but he loved him in the abstract, like a cherished but outdated photograph. He saw his father's quiet life not as peaceful, but as stagnant. He saw his humble home not as a sanctuary, but as a cage. And he saw his father's refusal to speak about his past not as a mark of humility, but as a sign of a life with nothing worth speaking about. The birthday had been a quiet affair. David had arrived late, a brightly wrapped box in his hand, his phone already buzzing with emails from the office. He had given his father the tie with a distracted smile. "Happy birthday, Dad. It's for the dinner with my boss next week. You know, Mr. Sterling. It's a big deal. I need you to, well, to look the part." Arthur had taken the box. He had opened it and looked at the tie. It was a simple, dark blue wool, with a barely visible pattern of small, silver chevrons. David had likely found it in a clearance bin, a last-minute purchase to fulfill an obligation. He saw the cheap fabric, the simple design. "It'll do," David had added, already looking at his phone. "Just try to fit in, okay?" Arthur had simply nodded, his expression unreadable. He had folded the tie and placed it in his drawer, next to a small, velvet-lined box that he never opened. David didn't know his father as a young man. He didn't know the man who had moved through the world with a silent confidence that had nothing to do with tailored suits or expensive watches. He didn't know that his father's hands, which he now saw as merely old and calloused, had once been weapons, had once held the fate of nations in their steady grip. All he saw was an old man, a father he was struggling to reconcile with the gleaming, modern world he so desperately wanted to conquer. And the dinner, for David, was a battlefield in that conquest. It was a chance to impress Sterling, to show him that he was more than just a hungry junior executive, that he came from, well, he wasn't sure what he wanted to show. He just knew that his father, with his quiet ways and his cheap tie, felt like a liability. A weight holding him down. He was a son who was about to learn that the foundations he was so eager to escape were, in fact, the only things truly holding him up. The restaurant was a fortress of quiet, old-world power. The maitre d' moved with the silent efficiency of a seasoned general, guiding his patrons to their designated tables with a discreet nod. The air hummed with the low murmur of important conversations, the clinking of heavy silverware on fine china a percussive backdrop to the exchange of influence and capital. It was a world built on unspoken rules, on the subtle language of status communicated through the cut of a suit, the vintage of a wine, the confident ease of those who belonged. And into this world, Arthur's tie was a discordant note, a deliberate and jarring error. Mr. Sterling, a man who saw the world as a series of ledgers to be balanced in his favor, noticed it immediately. His eyes, the color of polished steel, had flickered to the knot at Arthur's throat the moment they sat down, and a small, cruel smile had played on his lips. Now, the smile was gone, replaced by a mask of performative concern. "David," he said, his voice just loud enough to command the attention of the table, turning what should have been a private comment into a public decree. "I've always said that presentation is everything. It isn't about vanity. It's about respect. Respect for the occasion, respect for your hosts, and most importantly, respect for yourself." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. David's face flushed a deep, painful red. He wanted the floor to swallow him whole. He risked a glance at his father. Arthur had not moved. His gaze was calm, his posture relaxed. He was simply listening, as if to a mildly interesting lecture on a topic that did not concern him. This quiet defiance, this utter lack of shame, was what seemed to infuriate Sterling the most. He had expected the old man to shrink, to stammer, to apologize for his very presence. Instead, he was met with a wall of serene indifference. "When a man doesn't take the time to present himself properly," Sterling continued, his focus now narrowing directly on Arthur, though he still addressed his words to David, "it sends a message. It says, I do not value this. I do not value you." The accusation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. David felt a desperate need to defend his father, but the words caught in his throat. What could he say? He agreed with Sterling. He was ashamed. He had begged his father to wear the new silk tie he'd offered to buy him, but Arthur had quietly refused, holding up the cheap wool one. "This one has a story," was all he had said. And now that story was a public humiliation. A young waiter, no older than David, approached the table to refill their water glasses. He moved with a nervous grace, intimidated by the palpable tension. As he leaned over Arthur's shoulder, his eyes caught the tie. He saw what the others saw. It was old, it was unassuming. But he saw something else, too. He saw the knot. It was unlike any knot he had ever seen. It was small, tight, and perfectly symmetrical, a complex series of interlocking folds that seemed impossible for such a simple piece of cloth. It had a kind of brutalist elegance, a purposefulness that had nothing to do with aesthetics. His gaze flickered to the old man's hands, to the faded scar that ran across his knuckles, and a strange thought, a fleeting image, entered his mind: a rope, a parachute cord, a knot meant to hold, to secure, to save a life. He quickly dismissed it, his cheeks coloring as he realized he was staring. He finished pouring the water and retreated, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just glimpsed something profound, a secret language that only one person at the table seemed to understand. Sterling, misinterpreting the waiter's brief pause as a shared moment of disdain for the old man's attire, felt emboldened. He leaned forward, a predator closing in. "So, tell us, Arthur. What is your story? David here is a rising star, a man of action. I imagine he gets that from you. What great battles did you fight in your day?" The question was a razor blade disguised as a compliment, and its edge was meant to draw blood. For the first time that evening, Arthur's eyes met Sterling's. And in their depths, there was not shame, not anger, not fear. There was only a profound and weary calm, the look of a man who had seen real battles, and knew that this was not one of them. The air in the restaurant seemed to crackle, the tension coiling tighter with every passing second. Sterling's attack had created a vacuum, and Arthur's continued silence was filling it not with weakness, but with an unexpected and unsettling power. It was the quiet of a deep ocean, a placid surface that concealed unimaginable pressure and strength below. Sterling, a man accustomed to dominating every room he entered, found himself on unfamiliar ground. He had fired his best shot, and it had simply vanished, absorbed by the old man's stillness. This enraged him. It was a violation of the natural order of things as he understood it. He saw Arthur's calmness as a form of insolence, a silent mockery of his authority. He decided to escalate, to strip away the old man's dignity piece by piece until he was forced to react. He leaned back in his chair, swirling the deep red wine in his glass, and adopted a tone of mock sympathy. "You know," he began, addressing the whole table but aiming his words like guided missiles at Arthur, "it reminds me of an interview I conducted last year. A young man came in, brilliant resume, top of his class. But he was wearing scuffed shoes. Scuffed. And I told him, I said, 'Son, if you can't manage the details, you can't manage the business. The details are everything. The shoes, the handshake, the tie.'" He gestured again at Arthur's chest. "They are the billboard you present to the world. And if your billboard is faded and torn, what does that say about the product?" David felt a wave of nausea. He was trapped in a nightmare of his own making. He had wanted to impress his boss, and instead, he had served his father up for ritual humiliation. He tried to speak, to change the subject, to do anything to stop the relentless assault. "Mr. Sterling, the appetizer is wonderful." His voice was a weak, strangled thing. Sterling waved a dismissive hand, not even bothering to look at him. His eyes were locked on Arthur. "Don't be so modest, David. Your father is a man of a certain generation. A generation that perhaps didn't place the same value on ambition. On making one's mark." The young waiter returned to the table, ostensibly to check on them, but his eyes were drawn back to the old man. He watched as Sterling's words, slick and venomous, slid off Arthur's silent composure like water off stone. The waiter was from a military family. His grandfather had been a sergeant, a man of few words and immense, unspoken authority. He saw in Arthur's posture the same ramrod stillness, the same economic grace of movement. He saw the way Arthur's eyes scanned the room, not as a tourist, but as a sentinel, subtly noting the exits, the staff, the other patrons. It was a habit, ingrained and unconscious, the mark of a man who had spent a lifetime assessing threats. And he looked again at the tie, at the strange, severe knot. He had seen something like it before, in one of his grandfather's old books, a manual filled with diagrams of military insignia and dress codes for units that no longer existed. It was a flicker of a memory, a ghost of a connection he couldn't quite grasp. Sterling, meanwhile, pressed his advantage, convinced he was on the verge of breaking the old man. "So, what was your field, Arthur?" "Let me guess. Something steady. Something reliable. Postman. Schoolteacher. A craftsman, perhaps." He said the word craftsman as if it were a synonym for peasant, his tone dripping with condescension. For the first time, Arthur responded. His voice was quiet, raspy from disuse, but it cut through the oppressive atmosphere with the clarity of a bell. "I worked with my hands," he said. "Just that. Nothing more." But the words, in their profound simplicity, were a statement of fact, not an apology. The camera of the mind would zoom in on those hands as he spoke. On the network of fine, white scars that crisscrossed the skin. On the slight tremor in his little finger. And just beneath the cuff of his worn shirt, for a split second, a flash of faded ink. Would be visible. A shape. An emblem. The partial image of a coiled serpent and a downward-pointing sword. Sterling let out a short, barking laugh. It was a sound devoid of humor, a sound of triumph. "Of course. A simple working man. I knew it. A noble profession. But you'll understand, in our world, in the world that your son is trying so hard to join, we don't build things with our hands. We build empires with our minds." He tapped his temple with a manicured finger. "It's a different kind of work. A different caliber of man." He smiled, believing he had finally delivered the killing blow, that he had defined and dismissed Arthur in a single, elegant stroke. He had no idea that he had just handed the old man a loaded weapon, and that the quiet craftsman was about to show him what his hands could truly build, and what they could just as easily dismantle. The quiet atmosphere of the restaurant was about to be shattered. The carefully constructed world of power and influence that Sterling inhabited was built on a foundation of sand, and a tide was coming in. The rising action had reached its peak, the tension stretched to a breaking point. Sterling, flushed with the success of his own cruelty, felt an intoxicating sense of power. He had, in his mind, successfully unmasked the old man, revealing him to be exactly what his cheap tie suggested, a nobody. An artifact of a simpler, less important time. He was now ready to deliver the final, crushing blow, a lecture on the nature of legacy, intended for David but designed to annihilate Arthur. He raised his glass, preparing to offer a toast that would serve as a final, public dismissal of his guest's worth. But the words never came. The restaurant door opened, and a presence entered that seemed to suck the very air from the room. It wasn't a loud entrance. There was no announcement. It was a shift in the atmosphere, a change in the pressure, the way the air changes just before a storm hits. A man stood in the doorway, framed by the dark wood and dim light. He was older than Sterling, perhaps the same age as Arthur, but he carried himself with an aura of absolute and unconditional authority. He was not a large man, but he seemed to fill the space around him. His suit was simple, dark, and impeccably tailored, but it was not the source of his power. The power came from his eyes. They were the eyes of a man who had seen everything, who had made decisions that had shaped the world, and who had no time for fools. His name was Marcus Thorne, and he was a legend. Not just in business, where his name was whispered with a mixture of fear and awe, but in the clandestine corridors of Washington and in the boardrooms of global corporations. He was a kingmaker, a titan, a man whose quiet nod could build an empire or whose disappointed frown could erase one from existence. Mr. Sterling, who had been in the middle of a sentence, froze. The blood drained from his face, replaced by a pallor of shock and disbelief. He looked like a statue, his wine glass held halfway to his lips. Marcus Thorne was his idol. His god. A man he had spent his entire career trying to emulate, a man he had only ever seen from a distance at conferences and charity galas. To have him here, in the same room, was unthinkable. The entire restaurant seemed to fall silent. The low murmur of conversation died away. Forks and knives stopped their clinking. Everyone, from the wealthiest patron to the youngest busboy, felt the shift in gravity. Marcus Thorne's presence was a force of nature. Thorne's eyes, sharp and intelligent, scanned the room. They were not looking for a table. They were not looking for the maitre d'. They were searching. They passed over the fawning faces of the city's elite, dismissing them without a second thought. They swept past Sterling's table, and for a heart-stopping moment, Sterling thought the great man was looking at him. He started to rise, a sycophantic smile already forming on his face. But Thorne's gaze went right through him. His eyes continued their search until they found what they were looking for. They stopped. They focused. They locked onto the quiet old man at the back table. They locked onto Arthur. And in those powerful, world-changing eyes, a look of something that no one in that room had ever seen before appeared. A look of profound, absolute, and undiluted reverence. The king had not come for the court. He had come for the man in the cheap tie. The world seemed to move in slow motion as Marcus Thorne began to walk. His steps were measured, deliberate, each one echoing in the cavernous silence of the restaurant. He did not walk toward the front tables, where the city's most powerful men and women were now sitting ramrod straight, hoping for a glance of recognition. He did not acknowledge the maitre d', who was scurrying toward him, his face a mask of anxious confusion. He walked past them all, his path a straight, unwavering line to the back of the room. His destination was clear. His purpose was absolute. He was walking toward Arthur's table. Mr. Sterling, who had half risen from his chair, sank back down, his mouth slightly agape. This was impossible. This broke every rule of the universe as he knew it. Marcus Thorne, the Marcus Thorne, was walking toward his table. But he wasn't looking at him. He wasn't even looking at David. He was looking at the old man. The simple craftsman. The nobody. David was just as stunned, his mind a whirlwind of confusion. He knew who Marcus Thorne was. Everyone did. Thorne's company was a global behemoth, and Sterling's firm was but a tiny vassal in its vast empire. What could he possibly want with his father? The young waiter stood frozen by the service station, a water pitcher held tightly in his hand. His heart was pounding. The flicker of a memory, the image from his grandfather's book, was now a raging fire in his mind. The knot. The posture. The quiet dignity. It was all starting to connect, forming a picture so incredible he could barely comprehend it. Thorne reached the table. He stopped, standing directly in front of Arthur's chair. He did not offer a hand to Sterling, who was now trembling slightly, a pathetic, hopeful smile plastered on his face. He ignored him as if he were a piece of furniture. He ignored David completely. His entire being, his entire focus, was on Arthur. For a long moment, the two men simply looked at each other. It was a look that spanned decades, a silent communication that transcended the noise of the present. It was a look of shared history, of shared sacrifice, of a bond forged in a place and time that no one else in that room could ever imagine. Then, Thorne's gaze slowly dropped. It moved from Arthur's weathered face down to his chest. It rested on the cheap, frayed wool tie. His expression, which had been one of reverence, now softened into something else. A kind of sad, knowing respect. A deep and profound recognition. The silence stretched on, becoming a physical presence in the room. And then, Marcus Thorne spoke. His voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. It cut through the stillness, and every single person in the restaurant heard it as clearly as if he had been whispering in their ear. "The Pathfinder's not," he said, his voice thick with an emotion no one could quite name. "My God. I haven't seen one of those in 30 years. He looked up from the tie and back into Arthur's eyes. "I never thought I'd see one again. I thought you were all gone." The words hung in the air, a mystery and a revelation all at once. Pathfinder. The name meant nothing to Sterling, nothing to David. But to a select few, to the historians of the unseen world, it was a name spoken only in whispers. A name that belonged to ghosts. The reveal had been made, but the full, devastating truth was yet to be unleashed. The monologue that would follow would not just change the atmosphere in the room, it would rewrite history itself. The name Pathfinder echoed in the silent restaurant, an enigma that held everyone captive. Sterling stared, his mind struggling to process the scene. The most powerful man he had ever known was standing at his table, speaking in a tone of hushed reverence to an old man in a cheap tie. It was a scene from a dream, a script from a language he did not speak. David looked at his father, truly looked at him, perhaps for the first time in his adult life. He saw the impassive face, the calm eyes, and for the first time, he realized it wasn't emptiness he was seeing. It was control. An iron-willed, absolute control over a world of memories and experiences that David couldn't even begin to imagine. Marcus Thorne took a slow breath, as if gathering himself. He then turned his gaze from Arthur and swept it across the table, finally acknowledging the others. His eyes, however, were not friendly. They were cold, hard, and filled with a disappointment so profound it was like a physical blow. He looked at Sterling, and Sterling felt himself shrink, felt the expensive suit on his back turn to sackcloth. "You," Thorne said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "You were talking about presentation. About a man's worth being measured by the shine on his shoes or the silk of his tie." He shook his head slowly, a gesture of both pity and disgust. "You have no idea what you're looking at, do you? You sit here in your palace of glass and steel, built on the foundations of a world you don't even know exists, and you mock the architect." He pointed a single, steady finger at the simple blue tie. "That is not a cheap piece of cloth. That is a Medal of Honor, a Victoria Cross, and a silent prayer all rolled into one. It is the symbol of Unit 734. The Pathfinders. A unit that officially, and for the safety of men like you, never existed." The room was so quiet that the sound of a single drop of condensation falling from a water glass onto a saucer seemed like a gunshot. On the screen of the mind's eye, text would begin to appear, stark white against a black background, as Thorne spoke. Unit 734, the Pathfinders, status, classified. Disbanded 1991, 30 years ago. Thorne's voice was now a resonant, powerful narrative, the voice of a man reliving the most important moment of his life. "I was a young diplomat. My convoy was ambushed in a country whose name you wouldn't recognize, in a conflict you've never read about. We were political pawns, left to die. For 3 days, we were hunted. They were executing us one by one. On the third night, as we huddled in a bombed-out ruin, waiting for the end, they came." He paused, his eyes finding Arthur's again. "They came out of the darkness like ghosts. No uniforms, no flags, no country. Just 6 men. They were the Pathfinders. Their mission was to go into places where armies couldn't go, where hope was a forgotten word, and bring people home. Mission profile, deep reconnaissance, hostage rescue, counter-terrorism. They didn't have tanks or air support. They had the gear on their backs, the knives in their hands, and a bond that made them invincible. The man who led them, the man who planned the impossible infiltration and the even more impossible exfiltration, was him." Thorne's hand gestured to Arthur. He didn't give orders by shouting. He gave them with a look, with a gesture. He moved through the world as if he were a part of the shadows themselves. And when he worked, when he did what he was born to do, it was the most focused, most terrifying, and most beautiful thing I have ever witnessed. Arthur Jenkins. Rank, Master Sergeant, Redacted, Commendations, Distinguished Service Cross, Upgraded, Classified, Silver Star, 3 OLC, Bronze Star with V device, 5 OLC, Purple Heart, 4 OLC. He has a limp, Thorne said softly, his voice now filled with a raw, painful emotion. He doesn't have it because he's old. He has it because he took 3 bullets to his leg while dragging me, a scared kid in a suit, onto the roof of the embassy for extraction. He never made a sound. He just kept moving. He kept us all moving. Sterling's face was the color of ash. He looked at the old man's leg, then back at his impassive face. He was in the presence not of a simple craftsman, but of a legend, a hero from a forgotten war, and he had mocked him. He had belittled him. The weight of his own ignorance, his own arrogance, was crushing him. David was crying. Silent tears streamed down his face, blurring the image of his father into a figure of mythic proportions. The quiet man who fixed his toys, who taught him how to ride a bike, who lived in a small, unassuming house. This was who he was. This was the story he had never known, the legacy he had been so ashamed of. Marcus Thorne leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper that was more powerful than any shout. You asked him what he did. He told you he worked with his hands. Let me tell you what those hands have done. The camera of our imagination would now cut to a rapid montage, a series of lightning-fast, visceral images, as Thorne's voiceover continued, each phrase a hammer blow. Those hands have set broken bones in the middle of a firefight. They have disarmed bombs with seconds to spare. They have pulled men from burning wreckage. They have held dying comrades, promising to deliver one last message home. The montage would show flashes, a close-up on a pair of hands, steady and sure, defusing a complex wire trap, the same hands applying a tourniquet to a grievously wounded soldier, the hands gripping the shoulder of a young diplomat, a silent promise of safety. You talked about building empires with your minds, Thorne said, his eyes boring into Sterling's very soul. The freedom you have to even think, to build, to profit, was purchased by men like him. He worked with his hands so that you could work with yours. He walked through hell so you could have your little piece of heaven here on earth. He straightened up, his monologue complete. The revelation was total, the destruction of Sterling's worldview absolute. He looked at Arthur one last time, and his voice, for the first time, was not that of a titan of industry, but of a man speaking to his superior officer, to his savior. The tie, sir, he said, his voice quiet. The knot. They told us it was a tradition. That every pathfinder wove his own tie from the cord of the parachute that first dropped him behind enemy lines. A reminder. Of where you came from. Of the promise you made. Arthur, who had remained silent through the entire ordeal, finally looked at Thorne, and a flicker of a smile, the barest hint of one, touched his lips. He simply nodded. The story was true. The cheap tie was not a thing bought in a store. It was a thing that was earned. A thing that was made. It was a life, a code, an honor, woven into a simple, unassuming knot. The silence that followed Marcus Thorne's monologue was not empty. It was heavy, filled with the weight of unspoken history, of shattered arrogance, and of a truth so profound it had fundamentally altered the reality of everyone at the table. Sterling sat completely still, his face a gray mask of horror and shame. The universe he had so carefully constructed, with its clear hierarchies of wealth and status, had been demolished. He was a king who had just discovered his throne was made of cardboard, placed at the feet of a true and silent sovereign. He had built his life on judging the surfaces of things, and he had just been shown a depth he never knew existed. He tried to speak, to form an apology, but his throat was tight with a shame so profound it had stolen his voice. What could he say? I'm sorry I didn't recognize your greatness. I'm sorry I am a shallow, arrogant fool. Any words he could conjure would be pathetic, insulting additions to his already monumental transgression. He opened his mouth, and a dry, croaking sound emerged. He closed it again, defeated. The power he had wielded so carelessly just minutes before was gone, evaporated under the harsh light of Arthur's quiet honor. David looked at his father, his vision still clouded by tears. He saw him now, not through the lens of his own ambition and embarrassment, but through the lens of Marcus Thorne's story. Every quiet moment, every unanswered question about his father's past, every scar and every silence suddenly made sense. His father wasn't withholding a past that was empty, he was protecting a past that was too full, too heavy to be shared. The cheap tie, the gift he had given with such casual disdain, was now the most precious object he had ever seen. It was a testament to a life of courage he had been blind to. He felt a wave of self-loathing wash over him, so intense it made him dizzy. How many times had he rolled his eyes at his father's simple ways? How many times had he wished his father were more like the powerful, polished men he admired, men like Sterling? He now saw with blinding clarity that he had been worshipping false idols. His father, the quiet craftsman, was the Titan. Sterling was the insect. Marcus Thorne, his monologue complete, did not linger to enjoy his victory. He had not done this for sport. He had done it to pay a debt, to right a wrong. He placed a hand gently on Arthur's shoulder, a gesture of profound respect. "It is an honor to see you again, sir," he said, the formal "sir" a deliberate and powerful statement. It was not a word Thorne used for anyone. It was a word reserved for a commander, for a hero. Arthur looked up at him, his eyes clear. There was no triumph in them, no "I told you so." There was only a quiet acknowledgement. He then looked at his son, at the tears streaming down David's face, and his expression softened. Finally, he looked at Sterling, and there was no anger, no malice. There was only a faint, weary pity. The old man had seen real enemies, had faced true evil. A man like Sterling was not an enemy. He was just, small. And with a grace that was more devastating than any angry word could have been, Arthur slowly, deliberately, picked up his napkin. He placed it neatly on the table. He pushed his chair back, the sound a soft scrape on the wooden floor. He stood up, his back straight, the slight limp barely noticeable. He adjusted the cheap, priceless tie. He did not say a word to Sterling. He did not say a word to David. He gave one last, small nod to Marcus Thorne, a silent message passing between the two men. Then he turned and walked away. He moved through the silent, watching restaurant, his steps unhurried. He was just an old man in a worn suit, but now, everyone saw him. They saw the ghost of the hero that walked with him. He left the wreckage of Sterling's ego and David's ignorance behind him, not out of anger, but simply because it did not matter. He had a workshop at home. He had wood to carve. He had his silence, and he was content in it. The lessons had been taught. The honor had been restored. The rest was just noise. The heavy, ornate door of the restaurant swung shut behind Arthur, leaving a profound and echoing silence in his wake. He was gone, vanished back into the quiet, unassuming world from which he had been so rudely summoned. He hadn't sought vindication, hadn't asked for recognition, and now that it had been delivered with the force of a thunderclap, he simply walked away from it, as comfortable in his anonymity as he had been in the heart of danger. He left the consequences, the shame, and the dawning awareness for others to grapple with. Back at the table, the spell was finally broken. David shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Dad," he called out, his voice choked with emotion. He stumbled away from the table, desperate to follow, to say something, to apologize for a lifetime of blindness. He reached the door and pushed it open, stepping out into the cool night air. The street was busy with the flow of city life, headlights cutting through the darkness. But the sidewalk was empty. His father was gone. He had simply melted back into the world, as elusive and silent as the ghosts Marcus Thorne had spoken of. David stood there for a long moment, the sounds of the city a dull roar in his ears, a profound sense of loss washing over him. He had been given a gift tonight, not the cheap tie, but the story behind it, a glimpse into the true nature of the man who had raised him. And now he was gone, and David didn't know how to bridge the vast, silent chasm that he now realized had always existed between them. Inside, Marcus Thorne gave Mr. Sterling one last look, a look of such utter contempt that Sterling visibly flinched, as if he had been struck. Thorne didn't need to say another word. He hadn't just exposed Sterling's ignorance, he had rendered him irrelevant. In the world that mattered, the world of quiet honor and real sacrifice, Sterling did not exist. With a final, curt nod, Thorne turned and left as well, leaving Sterling alone at the table, a pathetic, diminished figure amidst the ruins of his own making. The narrative now pulls back, the omniscient voice taking over, reflecting on the evening's events. The camera of the mind would linger on the empty chair where Arthur had sat, on the simple napkin left neatly folded on the table. It was a space that had, for a brief time, held more power and integrity than the entire, opulent room combined. Honor, the narrator would explain, is not a commodity to be bought or sold. It is not measured in dollars or decibels. It is a quiet, internal compass, a set of principles forged in fire and held in the silence of a man's own heart. Arthur carried his history not as a burden to be lamented or a trophy to be displayed, but as the very core of his being. He didn't need to speak of his heroism because he was still living by its code. A code of humility, of service, of quiet strength. David would eventually go home, but his own apartment would feel alien to him, its modern, sterile design a testament to the superficial world he had so eagerly embraced. He would understand now that he had been chasing shadows, that the real legacy, the real strength, had been with him all along, patiently waiting in a small house with a workshop in the basement. The lesson had been learned, not just by David and Sterling, but by everyone who had witnessed the quiet old man's vindication. It was a reminder that the world is full of silent heroes, of men and women whose greatest battles were fought in secret, whose greatest sacrifices were made without an audience. They are the foundation upon which our noisy, frantic world is built. They ask for nothing, but they are owed everything. The camera would perform one last, slow zoom, this time onto the tie itself. Left on the table in the chaos of the departure. No, that is not right. Arthur would never leave it. He would walk away, the tie perfectly knotted, a silent testament to who he was. The final shot is of him, from behind, walking down the anonymous city street, just another old man disappearing into the crowd, his honor intact, his silence restored. The story is over, but the questions it raises have just begun. We live in a world that constantly demands we prove our worth, that we broadcast our accomplishments and curate our image. But what about the quiet ones? What about the people whose value isn't listed on a resume or displayed on a social media profile? The truth is, heroes walk among us every day, hidden in plain sight. They are the parents, the veterans, the caregivers, the teachers, who live lives of silent service, whose integrity is their only uniform. They don't ask for applause. They simply do the work that needs to be done. We challenge you to look closer. To see past the surface, past the presentation, and to recognize the quiet dignity in those around you. Who is the silent hero in your life? Share their story, or your thoughts on this one, in the comments below. Your voice is a vital part of this community, a place where we honor the stories that truly matter. And if you believe, as we do, that these are the stories that need to be told, that honor and courage deserve a spotlight, then please, subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell. Join us on our mission to give a voice to the voiceless, to celebrate the quiet heroes, and to remind the world that true strength doesn't shout, it endures. Thank you for watching.